2571 Silent Forge. The heartland of the Eastern Quadrant, if the desolate wasteland could be called that, was gradually changing as Sunny drew closer to the coast. He was almost in the territory controlled by humans now, so Nightmare slowed down a little. Sunny cast his shadow sense far and wide, guiding them around local settlements, military outposts, and scattered patrols. After all, it would be quite troublesome if the Lord of Shadows had been noticed riding his frightening steed despite supposedly being dead. A small sigh escaped from his lips. The duel between Saint and Slayer had not happened yet. He was a little disappointed, but mostly, he felt content. Swaying in Nightmare's saddle, Sunny hummed quietly. I've gotten quite strong, haven't I? He was supreme, and commanded 4 supreme shadows on top of that: Saint, Slayer, Serpent, and Fiend. Nightmare was bound to attain a higher rank before too long, as well. Even Mimic had become transcendent. That was an amount of power far greater than he had ever imagined wielding. The Shadow Legion had grown significantly in the burned forest, too, and there were sacred shades among his silent soldiers now. Such a harrowing amount of power was the prerogative of a god, not of a mortal man. Denying that would simply be an exercise in futile modesty. After all, he alone was enough to conquer and destroy entire worlds. If that was not divine, then what was? The answer is pretty simple, though. Destruction was not what made one divine. Any fool could destroy something built by another. Instead, it was their stunning ability to create that distinguished gods from all other beings, and Sunny was not capable of creating a world. He was not a stranger to crafting miraculous things, though. Raising a hand, Sunny briefly touched his chest. Then, he smiled tiredly, remembering the long weeks he had spent in the Forge of the Dark City. That was where he had created a shadowbound memory of his own, and although the process was so difficult that he was yet to fully recover from its strain, he was quite satisfied with the result. Took me long enough, and it would have taken him even longer without Mindweave. The great hall of the ruined cathedral was enveloped in silence. That felt strange, considering that the shade of the King of Swords had been hammering here for the past year without ever growing tired. That was because the Shadow Legion had retreated back into Sunny's soul while he was unconscious and slowly recovering from assimilating Mindweave. Sunny did not pay the unfamiliar silence any attention, looking at the model of a vast spellweave spanning the great expanse of the cathedral and reaching all the way to its distant ceiling. I think I am about finished now. This weave had been long time in the making. Sunny had been designing it for around 2 years already. He had started thinking about it immediately after forging the blessing. Most of the work had been done before his unfortunate fainting spell, but Mindweave allowed him to solve the final lingering conflicts much faster. Of course, the Great Weave above him was merely a theory. It was a model created from manifested shadows, so there was no saying if his theoretical design would actually take shape in practice. But Sunny knew that he would not be more prepared than now anytime soon, or maybe ever. A shadowbound memory was different from an ordinary one. Anyway, it had to be. Its weave had the capacity to grow and learn, so the patterns had to be designed in a completely different way from what he was used to, containing both a rigid structure and a degree of freedom. Sunny had learned that while creating the blessing, and after witnessing how the spell improved upon his design, he felt confident enough to attempt forging a shadowbound memory of his own. No time to waste, then. With the threat of the Dreamspawn looming on the horizon and 2 fragments of Weaver's lineage left to collect, Sunny felt a bit of urgency. The vast tapestry of black strings above him rippled and dissolved into a torrent of shadows as he released them from the grasp of shadow manifestation. A second later, 3 figures stepped out of the darkness, walking toward the forge with determined steps. They were his own incarnations, of course. One was in the burned forest, while 2 were south of the Hollow Mountains, with Nephis, so 4 pairs of hands were what he had to work with. Even the Dark Lord of the Forgotten Shore had abandoned his throne to dedicate himself to forging the shadowbound memory, leaving Aiko to manage the operations of the Shadow Clan alone. The great anvil of the Shadow Forge was empty, with the shadow of the King of Swords standing behind it silently. Each of the incarnations placed the materials they had brought on its weathered surface. The last one landed on the anvil with a metallic ring, finally breaking the silence. Sunny looked down. There were shadows that had remained forever frozen after the Winter Beast's death. There was a fragment of polished ivory, a splinter of bone from the colossal soul serpent whose bone Sunny had found in the Shadow Realm, and then used to kill Slayer. There was a spool of Nether's diamond thread he had recovered in the Ebony Tower. There were strands of black silk woven by the puppeteer. And lastly, there were 7 iron rings. They were not simple rings, of course. Rather, they were links of an ancient chain, the chain Sun God had used to bind hope, which Sunny had pried away in the gateway hall of the Ivory Tower. One ingredient was still lacking, though. It was his blood. Letting a sigh, Sunny looked at the shadow of Anvil and smiled. You'd better ready your hammer. Today, he was going to require some assistance. Soon enough, fire roared in the forge, and the sound of the hammer striking an anvil resounded in the ancient cathedral once more. Sunny was crafting a shadowbound charm. 2572 Shadowbound. Crafting a shadowbound memory for himself was both more difficult and easier than forging the blessing. It was more difficult because, this time, Sunny was not going to get assistance from the spell. That was because he was not a carrier of the spell, and therefore did not enjoy the benefits of bearing its curse. However, he was also crafting a memory for himself as opposed to someone else, and so, there was no need to invent complicated tricks to accomplish the desired result. While crafting the blessing, Sunny had to split the forging process between the real world and Nef's dream, but this time, he could simply enter his soul sea and create the weave of his memory there. Plus, he had the benefit of having already accomplished a similar feat once. One of his incarnations worked at the forge with the shadow of Anvil, while 3 more sat down, crossed their legs, and closed their eyes. It glanced as if they were meditating, but of course, they were busy in his soul sea instead. Out of their in the silent expanse of his lightless soul, they wove a vast and unfathomable pattern out of strings of shadow essence. His 7 tenebrous shadow cores burned above them like dark suns, bathing the tranquil expanse of still water in the lack of radiance. Sunny had discovered something curious while preparing for the forging of this memory. It was that there was a limit to how many relics could be bound to a person's soul. For most humans, it was just one. Most humans only possessed one soul, after all, and it could not accommodate the anchor of more than one weave. For people like Nefis and Sunny, though, the limit was more generous, perhaps because they were not technically people. So, Sunny had the rare privilege of binding both the jade mantle and the memory he was going to forge today to himself. That said, he was not sure if his soul would be able to contain a third. So, he had to pour himself into creating this one fully. In the ruined cathedral of the Dark City, he crafted the charm from the links of the chain with which hope had been bound. This time, there was little forging and smelting involved. Even if Sunny wanted to, he was not confident in his ability to melt the 7 iron rings. Simply removing them from the chain had been a daunting effort, already, having taken all of his power and cunning to succeed. But luckily, he did not need to alter the form of the rings or melt them to create an alloy. He was not forging a weapon, after all, he was crafting a charm. So, most of the process involved grounding the fragment of the bone of the primordial soul serpent and frozen shadows into fine dust, mixing it with his blood, and then coating the links of the chain with it. I am sorry, I don't think you'll be satisfied with our craftsmanship today. The shadow of the King of Swords did not respond, of course, assisting him silently. As they coated the iron links with the mixture of frozen shadows, bone, and his blood, Sunny poured his will into the cold metal, willing it to absorb his intent and the essence of death contained in the black liquid. The real forging was happening somewhere where no one could see. His will was the hammer, and the world was the anvil. Each clash was far more destructive than any physical attack could ever be, sending ripples through the fabric of existence. Within the dark expanse of his soul sea, a grand weave was taking form around the 7 dark suns. Now that Sunny possessed flesh weave, the strings of essence could not cut his fingers anymore. So, each of his incarnations was faster and more efficient in creating the intricate patterns. His mind had become vast and seemingly boundless, capable of containing the whole design of the weave and all its infinite complexity, and yet, Sunny still felt strained, beads of sweat rolling down his many faces. Work. The design that he had only envisioned was now becoming a reality. He hoped that it would hold, but knew that it could collapse instead. Already, several junctions had come undone under the titanic weight of the Great Weave, and he had to change the pattern on the spot. The Mind Weave assisted with that, as well, helping him think faster and envision more possible solutions. However, the problems he faced could not be solved simply by thinking fast. He needed creativity, knowledge, and insight more than volume, and those were not affected by Mind Weave. Still, he had not failed to solve an emerging problem yet. Time passed slowly, and as it did, he only felt more burdened. He felt tired. Torrents of shadow essence flowed from his domain into his soul, and then from his soul into the weave. The clash between his will and the cold metal of the metal links, as well as the world itself, continued without ever abating. The weave encompassing the dark heavens of his soul sea continued to grow and expand, soon filling everything above him. An hour passed, then a day. Then, a few more days. On the seventh day, a small earthquake shook the forgotten shore. Standing in the throne room of the dark castle with a report in hand, Aiko swayed and stomped her leg on the floor. Hey, settle down, what are you, suffering from indigestion? But the tremors continued, only growing more violent. Frowning, she drifted into the air and flew to the window. Looking down upon the dark city, Aiko realized that it was not Mimic's fault, the entire city was quaking. Her gaze turned to the ruined cathedral. On a dark square, the members of the Shadow Clan who had been training there were struggling to stay upright. June swayed with the rest of them, then glanced at their taciturn instructor with a tense expression. Oddly enough, Saint seemed completely calm, keeping her balance easily as if rooted in the ground. She was looking in the direction of a tall, magnificent, ruined building that was towering above the surrounding streets in the distance. In the vast silence of the ruined cathedral, the shadow of the King of Swords took a step back and tilted its head, looking at the 7 black rings laying side by side on the radiant anvil. On the other side of it, Sunny smiled tiredly and wiped his sweat with a trembling hand. It's done. He had succeeded. The runes shimmered in the air in front of him. They read, Memory. Curse. 2573 The curse. The tremors stopped, and the vast hall of the ruined cathedral turned silent once again. The anvil, which had become brilliant due to the crafting of the curse, was emanating a red glow in waves of sweltering heat. Dust particles danced in the dim light, glistening like sparks of essence. 7 iron rings lay on the glowing anvil. Their dull gray surface had turned entirely black now, and apart from silk thread and diamond string coiled tightly around segments of each one, they had no adornments. The black rings were not connected, either, not yet, at least. Sunny let out a long sigh. All 4 of his incarnations did, rather, exhaling at the same time. The sound of their breath was like the last whisper of Forge bellows. The 3 incarnations that were seated on the floor opened their eyes and rose. The 4th one took a step forward and summoned the Jade Mantle. As dark, fearsome armor encased Sunny in an intricate carapace, he extended the clawed fingers of his gauntlet forward and picked up one of the rings. It lay on his palm, taking most of its surface, glistening bleakly in the red glow of the forge. He considered it foggy a long while, then brought it to the center of his breastplate. The ring touched the smooth stone-like surface of the black armor, and was then absorbed by it, coming to rest in front of where Sunny's heart and beast core were. The curse was accepted and absorbed by the Jade Mantle, taking its place in the socket of the underworld armament. As Sunny looked into the distance, studying the runes, his other incarnations each took one of the black rings and fused them into their armor. The remaining 3 would reach their intended masters soon, too. In the end, each of the 7 incarnations of the Lord of Shadows would wield one of them. The curse was different from the blessing, and from the Jade Mantle as well. Sunny had designed it with his transcendent ability in mind. It was a compound relic that functioned very similarly to how he himself lived. Each of the 7 rings was independently powerful, but their potency was progressively enhanced when 2 or more were fused together. Therefore, the curse reached its ultimate power, and took a step beyond it, when all 7 versions of Sunny became one, just as he did. That was how he had limited it, weaving a conditional flaw into the design of this powerful memory. That way, the level of power it could reach when proper conditions were met was far greater than it would have been otherwise, making the curse far more potent than it was supposed to be. Bind the relic. Sunny hesitated for a moment. Being able to bind a memory to one's soul was a wondrous boon, but there was a reverse side to it, as well. A relic bound to a soul was no different from a part of that soul, just as integral as the rest of it. Therefore, if the relic was destroyed, the soul would be hurt, possibly even irreparably damaged. The soul was just as bound to the relic as the relic was bound to the soul, so one had to be careful when making that choice. The benefits offered by the relic had to be worth the additional vulnerability it created. It was for a good reason that myths and legends were full of stories about powerful beings who put too much of themselves into a potent artifact, only for that artifact to become their doom. Sunny remained motionless for a while, then took a deep breath and activated the Shadowbound Relic enchantment, fusing the curse into his soul. What was the point of having doubts now? He would not have created it if he did not believe in himself and his craftsmanship. He wasn't foolishly seeking to strengthen himself by relying on a potent relic, either. Rather, he sought to express his own power better with its help. The difference between the two was subtle, but it made all the difference. Soon, the handy bracelet spoke into his ear once more. Your memory has been destroyed. You have received an attribute. Smiling faintly, Sunny summoned his runes. Come to think of it, he had not given them any attention for a long while. The shimmering runes read, Name, Sunless, True Name, Rank, Supreme, Class, Titan, Shadow Cores, 7/7. Shadow Fragments, 7,000. Memories, Silver Bell, Extraordinary Rock, Endless Spring, Weaver's Mask, Shadow Lantern, Shadow Chair, Overpriced Saddle, Weaver's Needle, Nebulous Mantle, Handy Bracelet, Quintessence Pearl, Definitely Not Me. Echoes, Shadows, Jade Saint, Soul Serpent, Nightmare, Shadow Fiend, Marvelous Mimic, Shadow Slayer. Attributes, Lord of Shadows, Flame of Divinity, Blood Weave, Bone Weave, Flesh Weave, Soul Weave, Mind Weave, Jade Shell, Fateless Curse. Concentrating on the last attribute, Sunny read its runes. Attribute, Curse. Attribute description, Damnation. Sunny stared at the description for some time, then coughed in embarrassment. To be honest, he had spent an unreasonable amount of time trying to come up with something profound and poetic to write there. The nightmare spell had given quite a poignant description to the blessing, after all, so, Sunny did not want to be outdone. He had considered profound sayings uttered by gods and demons, some of the most meaningful moments of his life, and even researched poignant quotes of famous authors from before the dark times. But everything he had managed to come up with sounded either hollow or too on the nose. In the end, frustrated and utterly exhausted, but still failing to decide on a description, he could not stop himself from exclaiming, Damnation! In a fit of anger. And after throwing his hands up in the air, he simply went and put that as the description. After all, that was a curse as well, albeit of a different kind. Let's hope no one ever sees these runes. Shaking his head in shame, Sunny moved his gaze lower. There, the runes listed the enchantments of his new attribute. Just like the blessing, the curse possessed 7 enchantments. They were Bound, Dark Embrace, Absence of Light, Mercy of Shadow, Shadow Flame, Weakening Curse, and Chain. 2574 Shadowbound. Sunny regarded the runes for a while, thinking. No matter how he looked at it, he had done well. If you don't praise yourself, who will? Sunny scoffed and turned away from the glowing anvil, walking outside to enjoy the cool air of the dark city. Forging the curse had been difficult. The true hardship, however, was in imagining what the shadowbound memory needed to be. Sunny had always known one thing, at least, that he wanted it to be a charm. The underworld armament enchantment of the Jade Mantle, which enhanced the effect of any charm slotted into the soulbound armor, had gone unused for too long. That had always gnawed at him a little. At the same time, Sunny knew that he did not want to rely on external power too much, or better yet at all. That was a path that could offer him great benefits at the moment, but would lead him to a dead end in the long run. His goal was to become a god, after all, and gods did not need power in potent tools. They were the power. So, any charm he would forge had to help him use his own aspect more effectively, as opposed to gifting him new powers. Ideally, it had to close any blind spots his own aspect had as well. But therein lay the problem. In a way, Sunny's greatest power was his versatility. He could do a little bit of everything, and do it well, so, his powers did not have any glaring blind spots. Which was not to say that there weren't any, of course. For example, he lacked a truly effective tool to deal with large groups of weaker enemies. Nephis could incinerate a vast swarm of lesser nightmare creatures with one obliterating explosion, but Sunny would have to kill them all by hand. In the best case, he would send the Shadow Legion into battle instead. There were other instances like that, too. So, the set of enchantments he had designed for the curse was meant to make up for his few minor deficiencies, as well as make his strengths even more pronounced. The bound enchantment was self-explanatory. It was the core enchantment of every soulbound or shadowbound memory, allowing it to grow alongside its master. Both the Jade Mantle and the Blessing possessed the same one, as well. Things got more interesting when it came to the other 6 enchantments, though. The curse had 2 states, a passive one and an active one. It could be summoned independently, but ideally, the curse would only become active when Sunny summoned the Jade Mantle, and therefore always be enhanced by the underworld armament as a result. The Dark Embrace enchantment was the only one that functioned when the curse was in its passive state. It was a nurturing enchantment that enhanced the power of the dark flames of his soul by drawing on his spirit essence. As a result, the flames repaired the damaged shades and wounded shadows faster, allowing them to return to battle sooner. It also gave him the ability to soothe the pain of living beings by touching them. Shadow God was also the god of solace, after all, as well as death. So, Sunny had designed a pattern that he called the Pain Killer and wove it into the broader weave of the Dark Embrace. If he was honest with himself, though, that part of the enchantment had taken him a great amount of time and effort to complete, more time and effort, perhaps, than what the Dark Embrace was mainly supposed to accomplish, even. His reason was easy to discern, of course. There was a particular person whose pain Sunny wanted to soothe, even if she had never asked for it and would never seek relief from that burden herself. Neffys might have learned to endure the torment of her flaw, but Sunny was not willing to watch her endure it. So, he hoped that she would find some measure of solace at least in his embrace. The other 5 enchantments of the curse could only be used in its active state. The absence of light was the most straightforward. It was an altered version of the enchantment he had designed in Ariel's game to create the Evening Star, a charm memory that now belonged to Saint. The Evening Star enhanced Saint when she was surrounded by darkness. The darker her surroundings were, the greater enhancement she received. The absence of light had a similar function, but the condition set for it was not connected to how dark it was around Sunny, but rather to how deep the shadows around him were. The difference was subtle, but impactful. Shadows were created by the absence of light, after all, and were often darker, deeper, and most stark when a powerful source of light was nearby. So, the absence of light would not grant Sunny any power in true darkness. However, it would strengthen him when surrounded by mundane darkness or stark shadows and radiant light instead. Mercy of Shadow was the key enchantment of the curse. It was straightforward in its function, as well, but while that function granted Sunny a powerful boon in and of itself, its true purpose was to work in tandem with 2 other enchantments of the Shadowbound charm. The Mercy of Shadow enhanced the death quality of his will. It made Sunny more lethal through no other means than lethality itself. In that regard, it was similar to the Slaying Blade ability of Serpent. However, while the result was the same, the cause was different. Serpent was able to suppress and partially ignore the will of powerful beings that were cut by its blade. The Mercy of Shadow, however, enhanced Sunny's own will to kill. The true beauty of it all was the dreadful synergy between the two. With the adversary's will bypassed and Sunny's own death will made more tyrannical, the gap between the two grew that much wider. So, the combination of the Slaying Blade and Mercy of Shadow truly made him an incarnation of death. Death incarnate. That was not the only synergy Sunny had in mind while designing the curse, though. The Shadow Flame enchantment was an elegant one. It drew inspiration from Neff's Soul Flame, but not in an obvious way. Sunny and Neffys were similar in the sense that they could enhance themselves or their weapons with their dormant ability. However, the mechanism of their augmentations differed in one subtle, but important way. Sunny possessed 7 shadows, while Neffys possessed a single reservoir of Soul Flame. Therefore, the enhancement Sunny could grant was divided into 7 parts, while Neff's could be divided freely in any proportion. She could pour all of her flame into making herself stronger, keep 1/3 of it for herself and pour everything else into her weapon. Or even divide it into 1,000,000 weaker boons, sharing it with 1,000,000 people bound to Hiji domain. Sunny could not do that. But with the Shadow Flame he could, and that would allow him to strengthen not only himself, but also his Shadow Legion. Of course, dividing the augmentation of his 7 shadows between 1,000,000 shades would not make each individual shade that much stronger. A few thousand elites, though, that could make all the difference. That was especially true because the gap between ranks grew exponentially. So while 1,000 transcendent shades would not benefit much from receiving 1,000th of Sunny's augmentation, 1,000 awakened shades would benefit tremendously. Sunny had high hopes for the Shadow Flame. It had another use, as well, one tied closely to the next enchantment of the curse. The Weakening Curse was what had given the Shadowbound charm its name. Its function was quite simple, which was not to say that designing its elegant weave had been simple. In fact, that single enchantment had taken all of Sunny's ingenuity to create. But the result was worth it. The Weakening Curse reversed the effect of his dormant ability. Instead of wrapping his shadows around himself, his memories, his shadows, or his shades to enhance them, it allowed him to wrap them around his enemies to sap their power away. 2575 The Chain. Weakening Curse allowed Sunny to do the exact opposite of what he was supposed to be capable of. His dormant ability, Shadow Control, was the reason why his invaluable shadow helpers could augment him, or things that belonged to him, as well as those beings who belonged to his domain. Similarly, while the Weakening Curse was active, beings held in the cold embrace of his shadows would become weaker. Naturally, the effect was cumulative, and just as Sunny gained progressively more power when several shadows augmented him, his enemies would lose progressively more of their own when more than one shadow wrapped itself around them. There were situations where making the enemy weaker was more beneficial than making oneself stronger. Deciding which action was of more use in a particular battle would require careful consideration, no doubt, and there was the question of safety, as well. Embracing the enemy was not the safest tactic in most cases, after all. Even without the potential danger of branding a lethal foe with the weakening curse, the utility of this enchantment seems situational at best, though, and questionable at worst, at least compared to what Sunny could do naturally. However, there were two reasons the weakening curse was actually far more harrowing a power than it seemed. First was the underworld armament. The second was its synergy with the Shadow Flame and the Mercy of Shadow. Shadow Flame, Mercy of Shadow, and the weakening curse. These three enchantments each possessed its own value, but they were really designed to work together. Shadow Flame allowed Sunny to share the augmentation of his shadows among a great number of targets. Therefore, it also allowed the weakening curse to affect a great number of victims. Who was to say that he could only curse 7 foes, or one powerful enemy 7 times over? With the Shadow Flame and the weakening curse working in tandem, he could rob thousands of enemies of their strength, tens of thousands of them, or even millions if he wished to. And that was not all. Sunny and his shadows were inseparable, and each of them was a conduit of his will. So, all beings empowered or weakened by them were connected to him, and he could use that connection to channel his death will into them. Which, of course, would itself be empowered by the Mercy of Shadow. And all of it, the enhancement of the Shadow Flame, the insidious hex of the weakening curse, and the merciless finality of the Mercy of Shadow would be augmented by the underworld armament as well. In other words, if Sunny decided to share the augmentation of his shadows with 1,000 shades, the boon they would receive would be greater than his own. And if he decided to weaken 1,000 nightmare creatures, the sum of power they lost would be greater than what he would have received. His death will would be greatly enhanced, as well. So much so that his killing intent would be actually fatal to creatures of lesser ranks, much like a distant echo of Nether's killing intent had almost killed Sunny once upon a time, in the eye of the storm on the Great River. Nephis could wipe out a swarm of nightmare creatures with one powerful explosion. With the chilling synergy between the Shadow Flame, the weakening curse, and the Mercy of Shadow, though, Sunny did not need an explosion. He could simply wish the creatures dead, and their lifeless bodies would fall to the ground. Granted, one of Neph's obliterating explosions would still be more devastating. But Sunny could put on quite a respectable show as well. Now, that was the solution he had come up with to make up for the most glaring blind spot of his otherwise supremely versatile aspect. Quite fitting for someone who calls himself the Sovereign of Death, is it? Not. Looking at the dark splendor of the ancient city that sprawled in front of him, Sunny smiled faintly. For some reason, at that moment, he finally felt like a demigod. The things he could achieve with the curse were not really more impressive than what he could already do, just different. However, the ability to kill someone by simply looking at them and wishing them dead felt distinctly beyond the mortal realm. It was something that only those who were more divine than mortal were supposed to be capable of. Of course, Sunny could probably achieve something similar already, albeit on a smaller scale. It was just that he had never had a reason or wanted to unleash the full force of his death will upon mundane people, and someone like him had few opportunities to face nightmare creatures of the lower ranks. Sunny sighed. I only ever fight things that are unreasonably powerful. Granted, he was an unreasonably powerful thing himself, as well. And finally, there was the last enchantment of the curse. The chain. It was as much of a utility enchantment as it was the ultimate one. The chain was what made the curse a compound memory, now attribute, and allowed the 7 links to enhance each other when combined into a single chain. The passive effect of the CHAN allowed the power of the curse to grow steadily as Sunny enhanced himself with his shadows. However, it could only be truly activated when all 7 of his incarnations fused into one, and when all 7 links were combined together. Once activated, the chain produced a resonance between individual links, making the sum of their power greater than its parts. All enchantments of the curse received a fearsome boost, making it even more harrowing. The chain had a secondary function when activated, as well. It could be manifested and used to bind something, or someone. In this state, the chain embodied the concept of permanence. Therefore, it could be used both offensively and defensively. It could be used, for example, to bind a powerful enemy in place. However, it could also be used to bind Sunny himself, thus pinning a snapshot of his existence to the fabric of reality. No matter how his body was mangled afterward while the chain was active, it would return to the form it had been before. The same went for his soul, spirit, and mind. So if he had to use shadow dance and felt like losing himself in the process, in theory, the chain would be able to bring him back. It could be a tether that bound Sunny to himself, as well, at least until he found a way to regain his true name. That was what he was hoping for. However, as with all things having to do with concepts and higher planes of existence, the actual result was hard to predict. It was a bit of a mystery even for the person who had woven the enchantment. Nevertheless, Sunny felt a strange affection for the chain. His existence had become quite vague and ephemeral ever since all traces of him were erased from reality. He was not attached to the world by the strings of fate anymore, and the delicate tethers of human connections he had created were now tenuous at best. Nothing chained him to the world. So, the chain could do that instead. It was a tool with which he could root himself firmly into the fabric of existence, and therefore not feel like he could be dispelled by a gust of wind like a fragile mirage. Letting out a quiet sigh, Sunny smiled and dismissed the jade mantle, thus allowing the curse to disappear into his soul. After years of planning and meticulously developing the design of the astonishing weave, he had finally created his own shadow-bound relic. He had created the curse. Whistling a simple melody, Sunny headed for the dark castle. All things considered, I think it went well. Now, all he wanted to do was rest. 2576 Rat Problem. Sunny did get some rest after crafting the curse, most of his incarnations did, at La Street. A few more remained busy with other endeavors, handling tasks that never seemed to stop. Sunny had to admit, for a dead man, he was quite busy. One of his incarnations was setting up a base of operations in Ravenheart, for example. Another was developing spells meant to guard the citadels of humanity with Cassie. And lastly, just a day or two before Mordred rose to the throne of supremacy, one of Sunny's incarnations led the Shadow Legion into a decisive battle against the Black Millipede tribe. Out there, far north of the Dark City, the great tangle of the burned forest sprawled beneath the ashen sky. The charred mass of fallen trees was frothing and seething as it expelled a constant flood of something that looked like a black liquid from afar. It was not a liquid at all, though. Instead, the black flood consisted of countless chitinous bodies that crawled from underneath the broken trees like an unceasing torrent. Now that the battle moved close to the nests of the Black Millipede tribe, its 6 remaining queens threw everything they had into resisting the sinister invader, fighting for each meter of land with chilling cunning and ferociousness. Today, however, like every day for the last few weeks, the lethal flood of appalling millipedes had met its match. That was because a different plague had been spreading across the vast expanse of the charred Tangle E, hidden from view in its depths. The burned forest was suffering from a rat infestation. At first, there had been a single rat, the shadow of a rat, even. However, that one rat was no mere rat, it was the king of all rats, no less, in all its sacred glory. The Rat King had spread like a plague in the weeks after Sunny first summoned him to the burned forest, consuming the black millipedes slain by the Shadow Legion and gnawing on the blackened forest itself when there were none to devour. Once the number of rats grew enough, the sacred shade became capable of tearing them apart all by itself, which only increased the rate of its growth. By now, the flood of the grotesque millipedes was almost dwarfed by the seething ocean of rat bodies scurrying along the charred branches and broken tree trunks of the Great Tangle. It was as if 2 vile tidal waves collided in the middle of the burned forest, unleashing an awful cacophony of bestial screeches and visiting an unimaginable level of violence upon the world. An incalculable number of rats were torn apart by sharp mandibles, crushed by slithering chitinous bodies, and dissolved in powerful acid. At the same time, countless millipedes were shredded with tiny teeth, buried under a mass of vermin, and devoured from the inside. Sunny grimaced as he observed the battle from the towering remains of a burned tree, playing with a single rat that kept trying to bite his fingers off. What a distasteful sight. There was a dark smile playing on his lips. The Rat King was growing, which was good news, even if the strain of sustaining its existence was draining his reserves of essence more and more. Shades of his own rank or those who were weaker than Sunny provided him with more spirit essence than what was required to summon them, but sacred shades were different. Calling them forth from the dark expanse of his soul sea was strenuous both for his will and his essence, so he could only manage summoning one. But the Rat King was worth it here, in the burned forest, where it had an almost endless amount of relatively weaker enemies to feed on, not only because the number of rats constantly grew, but because it meant killing 2 birds with 1 stone. When the Rat King devoured black millipedes, its power increased. At the same time, the shades of the devoured millipedes joined the Shadow Legion, making it stronger as well. That was why the conquest of the southern outskirts of the burned forest was going even faster than Sunny had anticipated, despite the weeks of his absence. The millipede queens would not have allowed him to get this close to their nests if they were not struggling. Still, he had not won a battle yet. Each time the Shadow Legion advanced, it suffered a crushing defeat and had to retreat. Then, Sunny was forced to wait days until his shades were mended while escaping the pursuit of the great tyrants of the Black Millipede tribe, who had long understood that there was only one way to destroy the silent invaders, it was to kill and devour their lord. If only these poor creatures knew that there were 6 others just like him where he came from. Their struggle was hopeless. The Shadow Legion rose from the darkness over and over again, no matter how numerous times it was destroyed and wiped out. Worse still, it returned stronger and more numerous every time. After all, the millipedes who had fallen in each of the battles or had been consumed by the Rat King joined the ranks of the Silent Shadows. By now, the Ember Queen, the shade of the great tyrant of the Black Millipede tribe, ruled more members of their appalling kind than any one of her 6 remaining sisters did. Sunny inhaled deeply as he watched the tide of rats slowly drowning in the ocean of millipedes. The Rat King was struggling, it seemed. Far in the distance, the elusive forms of the 6 millipede queens were hidden behind the seething mass of their harrowing children. It's time. He looked around, suddenly missing the company of his other incarnation. Now that Sunny was alone, there was nobody for him to talk to, even. Of course, talking to his other incarnations was no different from talking to himself, so he could just do that. He sighed. Godspeed. With that, Sunny turned into a shadow. His shadow grew, enveloping the world. And then, a tenebrous army rose from it. 2,577 encroaching shadows. The Black Millipede tribe might have surrendered a lot of ground to Sunny and his Shadow Legion, but it was still countless and fearsome, beyond fearsome, in fact, for almost anyone except him. There was an endless sea of corrupted nightmare creatures, 6 great tyrants, and a deadly retinue of their powerful champions, great devils and enormous demons alike, their glossy black chitin decorated with vivid and eerie patterns. There were monsters, as well, some of them dozens of meters long. This dreadful force was enough to wash over Earth and consume every human populating its dying expanse. The Black Millipede tribe was far more terrible than the entirety of the nightmare creatures unleashed upon the world by the chain of nightmares in and of itself, except for the final few gate guardians perhaps. But even then, the Millipede queens had numbers on their side. Sunny was facing the monstrous tribe alone. It was no coincidence that the Shadow Legion had suffered myriad bitter defeats, and that even his own shadow shell had been destroyed by these sinister abominations more than a few times. However, it did not matter. Sooner or later, the Black Millipede tribe was going to become a part of the Shadow Legion, and their long string of victories would ultimately conclude with a final defeat. Sunny was just not sure that it would happen today. While the Rat King clashed with the great swarm of monstrous millipedes, the Legion of Death rose from Sunny's shadow. Saint appeared first, riding atop Nightmare. She regarded the scene of unimaginable violence with cold indifference, then raised her tenebrous sword and clashed it twice against the rim of her shield. As if to answer, a sea of shadows rose from the darkness and surged forward. Then Shadow Legion split into 2 wings as it advanced. The left wing was commanded by Saint, who led the original shades into battle. Behind her were the shade of Darren the Serpent King and his daughter, Windflower, the Snow Wolves of Ariel's game, the Asuras of Condemnation and other the supreme shades earned by Sunny and Godgrave, the shades of 7 song saints he had slain, twin shadows of Solvane, the powerful shades of those abominations he had killed in Antarctica, and the remainder. Most of them were armed and armored by the dark weapons forged by the shadow of the King of Swords. The towering figure of blackened steel and infernal flame that was Fiend followed Saint into battle, as well. Serpent was also with her, flowing across the charred tangle like a river of onyx scales. The right wing of the Shadow Legion was a flood of black chitin, composed of countless millipede shades. It was controlled by the Ember Queen, her ephemeral form hidden behind the seething mass of her monstrous soldiers. Slayer rode on the carapace of the elusive Supreme Tyrant, surrounded by wisps of ghostly fog. The Shadow Legion spread into a wide formation, moving past the terrifying slaughterhouse of the clash between the Rat King and the vast swarm of the monstrous millipedes. The 6 great Taiji ants moved their reserve forces, as well, sending the elites and champions of their monstrous kind to contend against the advancing shadows. Otherwise, the great army of their abominable tribe would be pincered and eventually surrounded, suffering terrible losses and losing the ability to retreat if need be. Nightmare rushed forward, covering hundreds of meters with each leap. The aura of dread surrounding him made the slithering millipedes cower, and Saint raised her sword, ready to reap their lives. Before she could, however, the burned forest was suddenly drowned in blinding light. Sunny felt the shadows shift and retreat, washed away by the radiant radiance. Then, the roar of a devastating explosion rolled across the charred tangle, and a powerful shockwave sent clouds of ash flying into the sky. Directing his attention to the right flank of the battlefield, Sunny saw myriad millipedes dissolving into a cold silver light. You have slain A. You have slain A. You have slain A. Standing atop the radiant chiton of the Ember Queen, Slayer lowered her bow and regarded the devastation she had unleashed with dark malice. Moments before, she had poured her pure soul into the head of her arrow and let it fly. It was as if a falling star streaked across the ashen sky and landed in the carnage, obliterating both millipedes and the scurrying rats alike in the explosion of essence. So, the first kill of the battle was hers. Saint turned her head, as if looking at the murderous shadow across the vast distance of the battlefield. Slayer gave her a glance, as well, then calmly reached for another arrow. A moment later, Saint and Nightmare were among the millipedes. Her black blade lashed out, severing several monstrous abominations in half, while his hoofs trampled a few more. The two armies collided, causing the entire world to quake. Fiend let out a bellowing roar, plunging into the mass of millipedes like a giant made of sharp steel and flame. Despite his enormous size, many of the elder abominations dwarfed him. Their impregnable chitin parted under his claws, though, and plumes of smoke rose from the cracks in their carapaces, hinting the monstrous horrors were beings burned from the inside. Serpent clashed with a colossal great devil, coiling around its long body and constricting it until the black carapace cracked, and a great flood of fetid blood was expelled from its maw. The shadow wolves descended upon the monstrous millipedes with the wild ferocity of primal predators. King Darren led the shadows of the human saints into a deadly assault, the frigid winds raised by the shade of the winter beast howling as they froze and stiffened the bodies of the frenzied nightmare creatures. The battle entered a terrifying state of utter chaos, with annihilating forces being unleashed by both armies to grind the other army to dust. Observing the carnage from a distance, Sunny remained calm. It seems to be going well. 2,578 tipping the scales. The right wing of the Shadow Legion, composed of slain millipedes, was more countless than the left wing by now. However, while the millipede shades possessed great numbers and a startling amount of raw power, they had fewer exalted champions among their ranks. So, the situation at the opposite flanks of the battlefield was about even. Saint and Slayer seemed to be competing to see which one of them could slay more foes, though. As far as Sunny could tell, the results were far from conclusive. But both of them were terrors to behold. They are both doing well, too. Saint had assumed her true size, towering at 10 meters of height and wielding a similarly great blade. She was surrounded by a flowing whirlpool of true darkness, so Sunny could only occasionally catch glimpses of her. The shades under her command seemed to be fighting with a greater cohesion than the millipede shades under the Ember Queen's control, and she kept the front line stable by dashing here and there atop Nightmare, steadily pushing against the profane flood of monstrous abominations. Nightmare had changed in Sizzy to fit her new height, as well, becoming just as daunting to behold. In truth, that was no surprise. The tenebrous steed had been doing just that while carrying Saint all along, albeit on a more modest scale. He was a shadow creature, after all, and shadows were inherently shapeless. So, Sunny had a feeling that Nightmare took the form of a horse by choice, not because it was inherently his form. Because of that, his size was merely a formality. Come to think of it. Observing the battle, Sunny allowed a minuscule fraction of his vast mind to get distracted for a moment. He knew that Slayer was a shadow creature born from the shadow of a mortal woman who had cast it once, a long time ago. What kind of creature had cast Nightmare, then? Sunny did not know, but in all his life, he had never met another creature wielding power over dreams. So, the original source of Nightmare must have been a singular existence. It had to be, to have cast such a shadow. Focus. Sunny told himself to focus, but really, he was not sure that there was a need. He was capable of concentrating on countless things now, and there was no lack of attention he was paying to the raging battle. In fact, he was utterly devoted to experiencing and perceiving it in as much detail as he could. This was no ordinary battle. After all, this was the first major battle he fought after acquiring Mindweave. Therefore, Sunny was experimenting and testing himself, trying to see how far he could stretch the limits of his mind. At the moment, he was commanding thousands of shades at the same time. There was a certain gap between the speed with which he issued commands and the time it took the shades to comprehend and execute them, so he was slowly moving toward finding a flawless cadence, but generally, the combat effectiveness of the Shadow Legion had increased tremendously. It was not a disorganized mob of individual shades anymore. Instead, his silent soldiers fought like an actual army, a new and inexperienced army, perhaps, but a cohesive military force nonetheless. It was especially true because Sunny had two intermediaries helping him control the shades. Saint and the Ember Queen both served as conduits of his will and the generals of the Shadow Legion, lightening his burden and making his army respond better to his attempts to command it. There was still room for improvement, though. Saint is not quite there, yet. The taciturn Shadow was a truly fearsome presence on the battlefield, both because of her supreme rank in the Evening Star, which was being strengthened by her own underworld armament. The black millipedes seemed to melt under her blade, and several of their champions had already been slain by the graceful Jade Knight. But although she possessed the War Master attribute now, she lacked the means of effectively communicating her authority to her soldiers, that would probably follow when she became a tyrant. The Ember Queen, meanwhile, could only command members of her appalling tribe, which, needless to say, was a severe limitation. I think I have an idea of how to solve that problem. That would have to wait until the next time, though. For now, the Shadow Legion was performing well enough, it was even better than Sunny had expected. In the past, the millipede shades would be obliterated in a matter of minutes, and the rest of the Legion would soon follow, but this time, his silent soldiers were holding ground, giving the adversary as much hell as they were receiving. Even with the Rat King being slowly overwhelmed, the outcome of the battle seemed to be hanging in fragile balance, which was a far cry from the innumerable defeats Sunny had suffered. The difference is impossible to miss. Now, he only needed to give the Shadow Legion a little push to break the balance in its favor. Stepping through the shadows, Sunny appeared in the very middle of carnage, next to Nightmare and Saint. He wrapped himself around the taciturn Shadow, took a mental breath, and activated the curse. The absence of light activated first, albeit it did not grant him much power due to the true darkness unleashed by Saint, but that was all right. Sunny did not need personal strength at the moment. The Shadow Flame activated next, allowing him to transfer a measure of his augmentation to any number of beings. Then came the weakening curse branding the shadows of surrounding millipedes and draining off their strength. A moment later, the Mercy of Shadow poisoned their spirits with his death will. And finally, the underworld armament of the Jade Shell lowered the curse, making each of its effects more pronounced. A vast swath of the black millipede swarm reeled. Countless abominations suddenly seemed slower, weaker, and less tireless than before. Many of those who had already been severely wounded simply fell to the ground, lifeless, the profane flames of their souls snuffed out by his killing intent. Of course, there were simply too many millipedes crawling across the charred surface of the Great Tangle for the curse to put a dent into their astonishing collective power. But it was just enough to break the stalemate and tip the scales of battle into the Shadow Legion's favor. And once Sunny gained that foothold, he could not be stopped. 2579 long time coming. Sometimes, great things had small beginnings. The dark ocean of hungry rats infesting the burned forest had begun from a single beast, for example. Sunny himself, the Lord of Shadows, had been an orphan in the outskirts of NQSC once. A devastating rockfall could be caused by a single rolling pebble. Similarly, the curse did not immediately vanquish the Black Millipede tribe. In fact, its effect was not that significant when compared to the collective might of their profane kind. There were simply too many of them, and even the awesome power of a supreme titan was not sufficient to quell the grotesque swarm. However, if used at the right time and in the right place, it was enough to make a difference. Saint and the elites who followed her were facing the most fearsome champions of the Black Millipede tribe and the horde of lesser abominations who followed them. The Mercy of Shadow poisoned the souls of the nightmare creatures with the death will. Those of them who were weak and already wounded simply fell lifeless to the ground, creating gaps in the flood of abominations. Those who were too powerful to succumb to the killing intent of the Sovereign of Death still felt the cold grasp of his lethal authority, losing some of their vitality. Then, they were branded by the weakening curse and lost some of their power, as well. Both enchantments, as well as the Shadow Flame that allowed them to spread across the swarm of abominations, were naturally empowered by the underworld armament as well. That was enough for Saint and her elites to push their advantage and bring several dreadful great nightmare creatures down in quick succession. Once the pillars of the millipede swarm's offensive in that section of the battlefield fell, an entire swath of the abominable flood collapsed under the eerily silent advance of the Shadow Legion. The louder the grotesque millipedes screeched and growled, the quieter the merciless shades seemed to become. The abominations died all the same. And the more of them died, the more shades there were to continue the slaughter. That small victory swiftly snowballed into a complete collapse of the black millipede swarm. The breach in their slithering mass allowed Saint to cut deep into the vast sea of abominations and attack other powerful champions from the flanks while her soldiers pushed the advance from the front. Before too long, these great nightmare creatures fell like dominoes, as well. And soon after they fell, the entire western flank of the millipede swarm fell apart. The left wing of the Shadow Legion advanced, slaughtering countless abominations and threatening to encircle those of them who were battling the Rat King from the west. If the center of the millipede swarm fell, its eastern third would find itself being attacked by Slayer and the Ember Queen from the south while Saint and her forces descended upon them from the west. It would be utter devastation for the Black Millipede tribe. More importantly than that, Saint could choose to bypass the remaining two-thirds of the Great Swarm entirely and instead push north, where the Millipede Queens and their dreadful bodyguards were hiding behind the endless ranks of their revolting army. In the very heart of the slaughter, the corpses of the slain millipedes had formed a tall hill. With the battle still raging around it, Nightmare tore his way to the top of that hill and froze there for a few moments, blood dripping from his fangs as his eyes burned with terrifying crimson flames. Saint sat in his saddle, regarding the scene of unimaginable carnage with cold indifference. She studied the chaos around them and then cast her tenebrous gaze into the distance, where the elusive forms of the Millipede Queens were hidden behind the sea of abominations. Her gaze seemed to carry the promise of death in it. Somewhere else on the battlefield, Fiend took a deep breath and then leaned forward while opening all four of his arms wide. A great torrent of roaring flames exploded from his infernal MAW, incinerating hundreds of lesser millipedes and melting their black chitin into sludge. Not too far from him, Serpent had assumed the form of the Ember Queen, sowing confusion in the ranks of the millipedes. The elusive form of the great nightmare creature was immediately besieged by countless foes, but escaped their claws and mandibles by hiding in the fleeting moment between the present and the future. A great demon fell, brought down by the twin shadows of Solvane. Someplace else, King Darren and the shadows of Song Saints were surrounded by a vast field of shattered black chitin. The Shadow Wolves and the Asuras of Condemnation were rampaging in the reeling swarm. On the other side of the battlefield, Slayer had leapt into the mass of grotesque millipedes and assumed the form of the wolf. Her jaws snapped, tearing the throat of a huge great devil open, and then a chilling howl rolled across the battlefield, drowning out its deafening clamor for a few haunting moments. What will they do? Seeing the world through Saint's eyes, Sunny regarded the distant forms of the six great tyrants. The Millipede Queens seemed to linger for a while, observing the horrifying carnage in front of them. Their grotesque children were dying in scores every moment, and the losses were only continuing to mount. Finally, a peculiar ripple spread through the abominable swarm. Acting as one, the countless millipedes dove into the cracks between the blackened branches of the fallen trees, receding into the depths of the tangle like a frothing sea of black chitin. The black millipede tribe was retreating. Sunny extricated himself from Saint and stepped onto the surface of the morbid hill of slain abominations, watching the swarm recede with an arrogant expression. He closed his eyes for a few moments, and then inhaled deeply. Finally, after more than a year of war, the black millipedes had suffered their first defeat. And after suffering defeat for more than a year, he finally achieved the first victory. The first, but not at all the last. 2580 inevitable defeat. It had taken Sunny more than a year to defeat the black millipede tribe on the battlefield for the first time. But after that first victory, it only took him a week to bring their vile kind close to extinction. Such was the sinister nature of the Shadow Legion, it grew stronger every time it was defeated, and it grew even more after a decisive victory. A great number of grotesque millipedes, including some of their most powerful champions, had fallen in that last battle, and all of them fought under his banner now. Even if shades of the supreme and higher ranks did not possess the will and were therefore not as powerful as the beings who had cast them, it was still an obstacle that the wounded black millipede tribe could not overcome anymore. After all, the very reason they lost the battle was that the Shadow Legion had grown to a point where they could not defeat it. Perhaps if the Millipede Queen had committed to an all-out offensive and entered the battle themselves, they could have still reversed the result. But even then, it would have only postponed the inevitable. Maybe there were creatures deeper in the burned forest who could permanently erase shades from existence or possessed unholy powers to counter the Shadow Legion in some kind of way, but the black millipedes simply did not possess such tools. So, they were doomed. Sunny spent a few days after the battle recovering the soul shards from the corpses of the millipedes, finally, and waiting for the destroyed shades to be mended in the lightless flames of his soul. The dark embrace enchantment of the curse accelerated the process, allowing his army to be restored faster, so he did not have to wait as long as usual. In the meantime, Slayer was secretly tracking the retreating swarm to its nests. She moved unseen, using her keen senses and transcendent ability to stop the retreating swarm from a distance, and that was how the millipede queens themselves revealed the location of their nests to Sunny, painting targets on the map. Once the Shadow Legion recovered most of its strength, he led his army north, wrapped around Saint and riding Nightmare at the head of a vast river of rats. In truth, Sunny was glad to leave the battlefield behind, albeit it made recovering the soul shards much easier. Watching the Rat King feast on the dead millipedes for days on end was quite a revolting sight. The Black Millipede tribe tried to defend its territory fiercely despite the hopelessness of their struggle. The Millipede Queens attempted to battle the Shadow Legion a few more times, but every clash ended in their decisive defeat, each one more devastating than the last. When frontal battles proved to be impossible to win, they switched to different tactics, staging fierce ambushes and embroiling Sunny and his shades in numerous small-time skirmishes. That strategy proved to be more troublesome, but still failed to stop his advance. In all honesty, Sunny had to give the Millipede Queens some credit. He had rarely met nightmare creatures capable of such a high level of control over themselves. Nightmare creatures rarely retreated, let alone implemented complex strategies, even if there was no chance of surviving their demented attacks. But even that could not help the Black Millipede tribe. The ambush had failed to stop the advance of the Shadow Legion, and constant skirmishes had failed to stop it, too. In the end, their resistance was entirely broken. The last major battle the Millipede Queens gave was when the Shadow Legion reached the first of their 7 nests. After being decimated there, the Millipede swarm broke and fled, never to assemble again. Sunny burned the nest and sent his shades, as well as the Rat King, on an all-out hunt. Over the next few days, countless millipedes were pursued and slaughtered in the depths of the charred tangle. Sunny himself, meanwhile, continued to pursue the Millipede Queens with the core force of elite shades. With the help of Slayer, he never lost their trail. 5 more nests were destroyed before he reached the final one. Sunny had expected the Millipede Queens to defend it to their last breath, and was prepared to lay a deadly siege. However, in the end, he conquered the final nest and laid claim to his second citadel without any battle at all. He never got to kill the remaining great tyrants, either. In the depths of the final nest, he found half-devoured carcasses of 5 of the 6 Millipede Queens. It seemed that, when facing extermination, they had sacrificed themselves to feed their very essence to the 7th one. That final queen then fled north with a small brood of young millipedes, abandoning her nest and escaping from Sunny into the depths of the burned forest. He did not know what would happen to her and her vile ilk. Far more terrifying beings inhabited the core of the burned forest, after all, and creatures like that rarely welcomed weaker abominations invading their territories. Perhaps the last Millipede Queen would be devoured by a powerful abomination, becoming the end of the Black Millipede tribe. Maybe she would be able to flee far north and establish herself on a new territory, then spread like a plague once more. In any case, with the escape of the last Millipede Queen, the war against the Black Millipede tribe was over. Having expanded the Shadow Legion greatly, Sunny had finally conquered the southern outskirts of the former Heart Realm. He had won. Victory sure tastes sweet. Riding Nightmare across the eastern quadrant, Sunny smiled. He had tasted defeat too numerous times in the burned forest, so this eventual triumph washed away the bitter taste from his mind. Of course, there was plenty of land left to conquer in the burned forest, its outskirts and other cardinal directions, its heartland, the titanic stump of the World Tree. But that would come in time, no doubt. For now, he had other things to worry about. Cresting a low hill, Sunny stopped Nightmare and glanced ahead, a complicated expression appearing on his face. I've made it. In front of him was the ocean.